Well, as I mentioned before, in just a few hours, Rupert and James Murdoch and Rebecca Brooks will appear before a British parliamentary committee looking into the phone hacking scandal. Joining me now from London is Stewart Purvis, who's a former boss of the ITN network and editor of Channel 4 News. He's also a former chief of broadcast regulation at Britain's Federal Office of Communication. Mr Purvis, what questions would you like to see the Murdochs and Rebecca Brooks asked?
Well, I think the most fruitful area for examination is the moment where, if you like, the frontline hackers connect with the executives. That's a moment about 3 years ago. James Murdoch had been in the job of Chief Executive of News International for about 4 months. And somebody came to him and said, please sign a cheque for the equivalent of $1 million Australian dollars, which we're going to give to a man who's taking action against us because he says his phone was hacked. And James Murdoch agreed to sign that cheque. Now, why would he do that? What questions did he ask? Did he say, why am I signing this cheque? To which they might have said either, well, they might have told him the whole story, or they might even have said, look, you don't want to know the story. Now, Murdoch's explanation is that he didn't know the full picture, which I have to say is unsatisfactory, frankly. But there's a kind of catch-22 in all this. The more you focus on points like that, on key moments like that, the more it's possible that the Murdoch's lawyers may step in at the committee and say, don't answer that question because you may incriminate yourself in any possible criminal proceedings.
Well, indeed, because there is such a legal minefield, is it possible that this hearing will unfold and all we'll be hearing is, I cannot recall, or not to the best of my knowledge, or I'm unable to answer that?
It's quite possible. As you said, there's enormous anticipation here in London, but it could end up with what you might call antisappointment, which is actually, somebody compared it to rather like an England soccer match in the World Cup, where we all get excited, we all sit around the television, and actually at the end of the day, the whole thing fizzles out. If that is the case, what conclusions can you draw from it? Well, you certainly shouldn't conclude that because the lawyers have pointed out their rights to James and Rupert Murdoch, they've somehow conceded any ground. So that is a possible outcome. But I think just the theatre of Rupert Murdoch himself sitting there answering questions. Remember, when Murdoch first came to Britain, the British establishment didn't want him to own any newspapers. They didn't want him to own any British television companies. And here he is kind of face-to-face with the British establishment. So that moment alone, it must be worth something for the drama critics, if nobody else.
So given, as I said, the legal minefield that it is, what do you think then that the news executives have to gain out of actually agreeing to make these appearances?
Well, the question is, what would have happened if they hadn't agreed? Now, the law is not quite clear, but at the very least, there would have been a kind of summons to them to appear. Potentially, somebody might have come to their offices and served them with some legal document. Again, this is such uncharted territory that people didn't know. But, I mean, if it had come to that, that would have looked bad. So, in a sense, what they've obviously decided to do is to front up, to try to, put their case in the most honest, straightforward way they can. But on the other hand, I say they've got the lawyers saying, don't answer this, don't answer that. So whether you can do both those things, we'll wait and see.
How engaged is the British general public in this? Are ordinary people going to be glued to their TV sets today watching this, or is it something that's really only preoccupying the elite?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Certainly in terms of the phone-in programmes on radio, lots of people are calling in. There was a programme I just listened to now where everyone was invited to say what question you would like to ask, and actually some really well-informed questions were put forward by listeners. So at that level, you think there is an engagement. In terms of its conversion into kind of, for instance, voting intentions, there was a poll last night that suggested that the Prime Minister David Cameron, who is under a lot of pressure on this story, might in the polls be slightly better off. So, it's difficult to gauge.
David Cameron's due, I think, to give an address to your Parliament tomorrow. What's he expected to say in that?
Well, the problem he has is that the head of Scotland Yard, Britain's top policeman, resigned, almost was sacked, but resigned a couple of days ago. And he said, effectively, I am resigning because I appointed a News of the World executive to be my communications advisor. How come the Prime Minister did exactly the same thing, brackets, and he's not resigning? And David Cameron's staff have been trying to explain, well, that's different because, the police were meant to be investigating the news world. I wasn't. But his appointment of this guy, Andy Coulson, who'd resigned as editor of News of the World, said he knew nothing about the phone hacking, but one of his reporters had just gone to prison, so felt he had to resign. He then goes off and works for the Conservative Party. That's still the point at which David Cameron's judgment is in question. But there may be more to come on David Cameron's role. There's a report here this morning that actually he had dinner with James Murdoch and his wife and Rebecca Brooks just after the very moment that he actually changed the ministers in charge of the whole B Sky B takeover issue. So on the one hand, he was trying to say, oh, no, we need to change the minister because the last minister was anti-Murdoch. And there he is actually having dinner with James Murdoch. So all this stuff, at the very least, doesn't look very good.
You've worked in the media and in media regulation. Could better regulation have prevented this, in your view?
Well, I think that the Press Complaints Commission, which is the body we have in Britain where the press examines complaints about itself with independent help from outsiders, I think that system is discredited, particularly because, rather bizarrely, kind of halfway through this saga, this body actually criticised the Guardian newspaper, the newspaper which has led the investigations, actually criticised them for what they were doing. So people said, well, they hardly came to this with a kind of vigorous approach if they were criticising the investigative journalism which had led to the exposure of this issue. But I have to say, there's real nervousness, certainly amongst the media here, about going too far. We had a former British Labour leader on the radio here this morning saying that newspapers should be regulated the same way that broadcasting is. Now, I used to be the broadcasting regulator for content here in the UK, and that is a completely different way of doing it than the way the press has looked after itself. So that would be an enormous step if that were to be taken. And the press, I have to say, would put up a pretty big fight to stop that happening. In
the past couple of years, I've regularly interviewed British guests about major scandals in the UK. The collapse of the banks springs to mind. The MP's expense scandal was another. And every time people said, well, this is going to lead to major changes in British society. And then pretty much it died down. It was business as usual after that. Is this scandal going to be another one of those?
I think that's possible, yeah. I think there's, as I said, enormous excitement, partly about the whole, just what does Rupert Murdoch look and sound like? Actually doesn't appear in public very often, but actually how does that convert? I think the one area where it might convert into legislation is about what we call cross-media ownership. In Britain, the rules about how many newspapers you can control and how many TV stations you control are, let's say, they're relaxed compared to other countries. That's not to say they're right and wrong, but they're definitely more relaxed. So could that be looked at again? How would you define shares of market? There's lots of sort of argument about that. So I think something may happen on that front. But is the press going to be more regulated in terms of, are journalists going to be hauled up in front of courts and things like that? I'm not so sure about that.
Mr Purvis, we'll certainly be watching those hearings later on with great interest. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Okay, thank you.